Okay, thank you very much, Dorina, and good morning, everybody. As you see, the session, our session today is on the return of the coup d'etat and the persistence of the big man politics, causes and countermeasures. And this topic was chosen because, over the last few years, we've seen a number of high-profile coups that have emerged in Africa. There was a case in Mali, we've seen Guinea-Bissau, Madagascar, Niger. And while we don't call it a coup, perhaps the most widely known is what's happening in Egypt right now. And this caught many people by surprise because of the sense that Africa had been making progress over the last number of years, and we hadn't seen that many coups. And so it's led many people to question, are we seeing a reversal in Africa? Are we seeing the resurgence of coups? And more generally, can democracy work in Africa? These sorts of questions come up regularly whenever there's a crisis. And so today's crises are in South Sudan and the Central African Republic. And people are again asking the questions, are these places governable? Are they states? Can they survive with a rule by the people, or do you need a strong man leader, as has historically been the case in many African countries? And so to think about this, I think it's important to just sort of put this in a historical perspective, that Africa's undergoing a major political transformation. And it's a transformation that's been underway for several decades, since the end of the Cold War. And importantly, this is part of a global political transformation. So we've seen movements towards democracy. It's called the third wave of democratization in Latin America, Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, and now the beginnings of such change in the Middle East. So this is a global phenomenon that has been going on. And since the early 1990s, Africa has made noteworthy strides. At the end of the Cold War, there were two democracies in Africa. And in fact, nearly every state in Africa was a legally declared one-party state. So the notion of big man rule or autocratic rule was in fact legally enshrined in their constitutional systems. Since that time, there's been a dramatic shift. And in fact, I don't think there's a single state today that's a declared one-party state. There are about 10 or so that are, in fact, autocratic states. And during that same time, we've seen an increase in the number of democracies to about 8 to 10. Okay, so there's been shifts. Now, what that means is, the bulk of the rest of the countries are somewhere in the middle. And that is really where the change has been happening in Africa. So we've moved from 2 democracies now to the 8 to 10 that I mentioned, and then there's probably another 20 or so that we would call democratizers, or countries that are making demonstrable gains towards democratic forms of governance. You couldn't call them a genuine democracy. They don't have all of the checks and balances and institutional mechanisms of democracy, but they certainly have some multi-party competition, a degree of free press, some oversight, some civil society. And so they're different. They have made progress over the last couple of decades. At the same time, there's another bunch of countries that we call semi-authoritarians. So they're not the full-fledged authoritarians, but they're countries that may actually hold elections, but the outcome of those elections is never in doubt. They're not free and fair elections. There remains tight control on power. And they operate in many ways like an autocratic system. There isn't mechanisms of shared power or oversight. And so what this means in total is that we have great variance over the African governance landscape in terms of what we see, in terms of political governance. There's been progress, but the process remains incomplete. And in fact, the vast majority, some 60% of African countries are somewhere in the middle. And so where this plays out remains to be seen. I like to say this is the battle for governance norms that is unfolding across the continent. And this battle, as most battles are, is not a linear battle or progression. That, in 65% of the cases where a country has started to make moves towards democracy in Africa, they experience at least one episode of backsliding. And so, backsliding is in fact typical. And this is where some of the coups that we are seeing fall into place. At the same time, and less well recognized, of those 65% of cases where there's backsliding, 2/3 actually resume a positive trajectory within 3 years. And so rather than saying, things are always moving up or moving down, it's much more often that you have a back and forth experience. And the recent experience of Mali, I think, is a good example of this. Mali was seen as sort of one of the leaders in the democratization movement until it had a coup in 2012. And this had many people throwing their hands up in the air and wondering what was going to happen. And there were many difficulties in that period since 2012, but middle of last year, Mali had another election. They were able to move out the coup leader and reinstitutionalize, anyways, a form of democratic governance. It still is in the process of repairing the institutional damage that has been done, but it is, again, trying to operate on some sort of legal-based, participatory, inclusive governance model. And so when we think about Africa's democratization, we have to recognize that it's dynamic. And the notion of coups is in fact just one part of that. We see so much backsliding in Africa because there are so many vested interests in maintaining the status quo. Many African militaries are highly politicized. They've benefited under the old system through patronage, through special privileges. Many African militaries have economic interest. They own businesses. They have great control over certain sectors of economies. They don't want to give that up. Generals have outsized influence in their societies. Some generals haven't quite accepted the notion of civilian rule, or that they should give up their role as guardians of society in their countries. And so there are these, I think both conceptual, but I think probably more important, self-serving interests that have made many African militaries resistant to democratic change in their societies. So let's just be clear. There's going to be pushback. We shouldn't be surprised by that. At the same time, there are positive forces for change. As I had mentioned, civil society, youth, media. There has been a process of institutionalization going on. There are more elections in Africa than there ever have been in the past. They're relatively better managed than there have been in the past. The expectations are higher for participation in the political process across the continent. So when we talk about democratization in Africa, we have to recognize that democracy is more than elections, that it is a series of checks and balances. It's this model of governance that requires shared power, that it is a governance norm that allows for participation, allows for dissent. It tolerates different points of view. It allows multi-parties. And it's that appreciation that many African political leaders have failed to really grasp at this point. It's still a shallow understanding of what democratization means. And fairly, it's something that many international observers still look at fairly simply as well, where we're using the litmus test of elections as sort of the determinant of whether or not a country is of a democratizer. But in fact, democracy is a governing process. It's not just an event. It's something that has to happen every day. It have to be a recognition of protection of certain minority rights and opportunities for people, whether they're in or out of power, whether they know or don't know a political leader. And that's the thing that many African countries are struggling with today. This is the legacy of the big man rule that Africa is still trying to overcome. That it still has this legacy of autocratic government that is very personalistic, that whoever is the leader makes the rules, is above the rules. And that hasn't died out in many places. And so that's the tension that's happening, that there's this push for institutionalizing changes and governing more democratically, but the legacies are still highly personalistic, highly patronage based. And it's moving that forward that really is at the crux of where we're at today. So why does this matter for us in terms of our roles? It matters from a practical standpoint because whether or not a country is a democracy in Africa and really around the world has strong repercussions for stability and development. In Africa, democracies are party to less than 10% of the conflicts on the continent, while there are only 40% of Africa's states that are leaning to the autocratic side of the ledger. They represent 75% of the fragile states on the continent. Over 93% of all refugees and IDP, internally displaced people in Africa, originate from autocratically governed societies. And the instability in those places has repercussions for neighbors, since over 30% of all conflicts in Africa spill across borders. So instability in one place creates instability for the region. So democracies tend to be relatively more stable. And this is particularly important, I think, today, since over 90% of all conflicts in Africa are what we call societal conflicts. So, I don't like the term civil wars because often you don't have two sides pitted against one another. You usually have some sort of localized regional conflict that creates a high degree of instability within a country. But these conflicts are based on grievances, real or perceived, within those societies. And those grievances often have at their core a challenge to the legitimacy of the leadership in that society. Communities feel disenfranchised. They feel their government leaders are corrupt. They feel their government leaders don't represent them, and often with some cause in each of those cases. Not always, but it's an important pattern. And the World Bank's World Development Report from 2011 actually focused the entire issue on this relationship between conflict, security, development, and it cited legitimacy as sort of the nexus of these stabilizing factors. And so the issue of legitimacy is getting a lot more attention. So that's a key reason why we care about why democracy, or where democracy is going on the continent. Democracy in Africa also has direct ramifications for levels of development or economic performance. African democracies have economic growth on average about 30% more rapid than Africa's autocracies. If you take out the oil-rich autocracies, it's actually 3 times as rapid, and it also tends to be less volatile. So it's a steadier rate of performance. And the benefits from this performance or for the economic development tend to be more widely shared. So life expectancies in Africa's democracies are about a decade longer than life expectancies in autocracies. Infant mortality rates are about 40% lower. Chances going to secondary school are about 1/3 higher. And cereal yields are about 25% higher in democracies than we see in autocracies, which is important from an economic standpoint, since still 60-70% of all African people or citizens are rural-based, and so deriving their incomes from farming of one type of another. So there are social benefits that democracy tends to deliver relatively better than autocracies, which then contributes to more growth, more opportunity, and more stability. So let me just wrap up with a few key takeaways in terms of what I see going on today on the governance front in Africa. First is this notion that democratization is a process. It's not just about elections. It's what happens after the elections. It's about how fair those elections are, how participatory, how inclusive they are. And this is what gives legitimacy. And legitimacy is what then gives stability, or it adds to stability in a society. Second is that the democratization process takes time. Often people are frustrated when they see setbacks in Africa because their timelines are unrealistic for the rates of change that they're hoping for. What I've described is the need for stronger institutions in Africa, for democratic institutions. And this is a decades-long process, whether we like it or not. And in fact, if we look back to the early 1990s, you are seeing stronger institutions. There's stronger electoral commissions, there's stronger parliaments, there's stronger media, there's more civil society. So this institutionalization process is happening, but it's happening slowly, as I guess is almost a necessity. But we need to be mindful that there are going to be setbacks. That's part and parcel of that process of change. And when there is a setback, that doesn't mean that the process is over, because there is often this rebound. But the inverse is also true. Just because things are going relatively well doesn't mean that that country is free and clear, that it's going to be a democracy. It is also still subject to setbacks, as we saw in Mali. Now, by and large, countries that stay on a democratic path longer are less likely to fall back. So duration on that path seems to build the norms and expectations of what democratic standards that country is going to have. but it's not a guarantee. These norms, these standards really need to be internalized within a society for a country to be said to have consolidated its democratic system. And then lastly, is that there's an important role for external actors to play in setting and helping to set these standards and norms. That the expectations that external actors have also shape just how robust the democratic systems are going to be. If that standard is low, then that is the standard that's going to be met. And that's really what this tension, this game that's going on with the semi-authoritarians I talked about earlier is about. They want the credibility of being a democracy by holding elections. And if that is good enough to get the blessing of international community and get the rewards of being a democracy, then that's what they'll do. If instead, they are deemed to fall below the threshold of a democracy and are identified as such, then the incentives for them to do more, to open up, to involve more mechanisms of shared power and oversight are going to be stronger. Again, they're not going to do it willingly, but they're going to recognize that they don't have that same international standing and the benefits that come with it that a democracy would be. So let me end there and then turn it over to Charles, and we'll pick it up in the Q&A. Thank you very much.